Hello everyone and welcome to this live Q&A for Billie, hosted by the Barbican as part of the EFG London Jazz Festival. I'm Zakia Sewell, I'm a broadcaster and a DJ, a big jazz fan, and I'm here with the director of the film, James Erskine, and co-producer Shianne Brown. So we're going to start off, I'm going to ask a few questions, but then in the last 10 minutes, in about 20 minutes time, we will open up the virtual floor and ask questions that you might have submitted in the comments section. So please do send those over. And yeah, the Billie film is going to be on the Barbican website till next Sunday. So that's all the practical stuff out of the way. Hello both, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Good.
Another lockdown.
I know, trying to, it's hard. I thought maybe we should just begin at the beginning, and perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the inception of the project and how the documentary really came about.
Yeah, sure. I suppose the beginning was one of the producers, Barry Clark Ewers, who produced a lot of music films, came to me and said, "What's the music film that you've always wanted to make?" And I've made a lot of films about artists actually, but the last few years I made a lot of films about athletes and pioneers in different fields. I said, well, I've always loved Billie Holiday's music, and I think it's a really interesting story to explore and to re-explore in the current age. But there's this story that I've heard about this journalist in the 1970s who went out and tried to really explore Billie's story, not so long after she died, and this journalist, and she died in the search for that, and that's pretty uncanny and pretty. If you know anything about Billie Holiday, it's pretty uncanny that should be the case. But I've heard that she also she recorded all the interviews that she did on audio cassette, and I've seen some transcripts of those and that have been published. But actually, if we could get the real audio cassettes, that would be the extraordinary matter for a film, if indeed those tapes exist and if anything exists on the tapes. So he tootled off, and a couple of months later came back and said, I've got the tapes. And so we negotiated a deal with the tapes, and then we flew to New York. And part of the deal was actually that we didn't really trust, because these tapes are 50 years old, that there'd actually be anything actually on the tapes. So we said, okay, we'll pay you 20% of the money up front, and then we're going to come to New York, we're going to get in the studio, and we're going to actually see if these tapes have anything on them. So we did that. We went to this studio, very nice studio. Tapes arrived with the owner in a shoebox, beautifully served for we said, okay, what should we put on first? And so we saw one marked Charles Mingus and popped it in the machine, and immediately, that's what you hear in the film. You're immediately transported back in time and place. And what to me really stood out was that it wasn't just the stories that were being told, it was the voices that we were hearing that were sort of voices that don't normally get a run at being heard at in the current age, or perhaps ever. I don't know. And that was really fascinating. And so that's where it sort of began, and we sort of went out and raised the money and sort of put a team together. And I'd been working with Shianne on a different show, and I asked Shianne if she was at all interested in working in the show, and she said
yes. I agree. I've always been a massive Billie Holiday fan, and I'd read The Lady Sings the Blues, and I'd been very much obsessed with her life. And I think a lot of people would know Strange Fruit anyway, and that was a song that always resonated with me personally. And I just always wanted to know more about her, and I've always thought there should be like a big documentary about her. And then after working with James, and then he had told me about this project, and I just ran at the chance, and I just thought this would be such an exciting world to immerse myself into. And I think that's definitely played off in the film, because you really, like James had says, you feel like you are being transported to this entirely new world, which you might not have known much about before, and you get a greater understanding of Billie's story and the wider sort of social and cultural movement that was going on.
Absolutely. I mean, I love that image of just the sort of dusty box full of tapes and having no idea, what they were going to sound like. How much material was there to go through, and how did you kind of go about making your selections about which kind of voices you were going to include and which material you're going to include?
Yeah, I mean, there was 125 tapes or something, and as I said, they weren't in great condition. Some of them were snapping in the machine. We had to do quite a lot of preservation work, and some of them had been transcribed by Linda's sister, actually, who appears in the film. She'd actually been the person that typed them up. We later discovered, we didn't know that at the time. Many of them hadn't been. Many of them were sort of wrongly labelled or what have you, and so we basically, 3 or 4 of us, me, Shianne, and Barry, we sort of divided up the tapes and started listening, not knowing where we were going or what we were looking for. We didn't start with a script. We started with okay, we are, detectives, and we're going to find what's interesting to us and what's relevant. And I think Shianne should talk more about this, but one of the key things was relevancy. Billie's an incredibly contemporary figure in lots of ways, and yet she's she's obviously a figure from history, and we wanted to make sure that the film really sort of connected thematically with audiences of today, and wasn't just respected. It was totally about her as an artist, but at the same time explored her themes in a much more contemporary way than maybe conventional jazz history had previously.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it was all about listening initially. It was just to really immerse yourself into her life and into all of these different musicians and her family members and the club owners who she would have known at the time. And when I was listening to the tapes, I think what was going through my head is, how could we make her story relevant in today's world? And it wasn't hard to actually do, because what was going on is very similar to what is happening now. And I think it was making sure that we had voices of African-American voices in particular, and also female voices, because typically a lot of her life, Billie's life in particular, it was a lot of male critics, male record producers, and she was a woman, a Black woman in this world, which was kind of operating kind of against her. And it was important that we had these interviews which could speak truth to that and could speak truth to her story and her struggle, but then also in terms of her as an amazing sort of pioneer and a civil rights activist in her own right.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interviews that I really loved is Melba Liston, that Shianne came across, and there weren't many female musicians, on the big bands. It's a very male world, and it was sort of interesting to find a perspective of somebody that was much younger than Billie, that was experiencing the tour for the first time and sort of pioneering in her own way, sort of her insight, because that's an insight that doesn't feel like it's been widely available.
And I think also when you think about musicians, a lot of the times you can, especially jazz musicians, we automatically kind of go to the men who are playing instruments, and it's the women who are singing. And I think with Melba Liston, it was a completely different, she kind of flipped it on its head in a way, because he was like this amazing musician who was touring with all male bands, and was really incredible and talented in her own right. And hearing her perspective, I thought was really important.
Absolutely. I found it really refreshing that, you had the big names. Obviously, you've got Charles Mingus, you had, Count Basie, but then, you've also got some of the lesser known names, and actually probably some of the people who haven't necessarily been, asked to tell the story of Billie over and over again, who might actually have fresh perspectives. And I guess another thing that really kind of struck me in the documentary is that you weren't kind of shying away from the fact that these perspectives often clash, that you have these rival memories and rival takes on stories, and no, it happened like this, no, it happened like that. And it's quite often with these kind of big narratives about stars, people try and sort of bulldoze one line through without dealing with the fact that actually sometimes it's quite hard to know what really happened. Was that a challenge for you, dealing with these sort of rival, conflicting memories and perspectives of Billie's life?
Yeah, I mean, we started out with a principle that was that eyewitness, being an eyewitness, was really important. So if you watch the film back, you'll see that people are only talking about either something that they personally witnessed, or they're relaying a conversation that they have with Billie, where she is relating anecdote, and that was a really, because there was so much material, that was a really good way through, because it avoided sort of hearsay. The film by hearsay, which so much of documentaries can often be about, for obvious reasons. Billie's been dead, 60 years, and who are you going to go and interview? You're going to interview people who've heard stories or written stories about her. It's hard to get, to the eyewitnesses, and as we also know, all like in the classic, the Guardian adverts, or the any crime, the eyewitness has a different point of view, and that was really important to the substance of the narrative, which is very film noir. Of course, part of the question is really who or what kills Billie Holiday, just as it is about what happens to Linda, but really it's about what happens to Billie Holiday and why, and everybody gives their opinion, and it is their opinion. And if I was to ask somebody about Shianne, everybody would give their own different opinion or relate a different anecdote, and we didn't want to, we can't determine the truth. Billie's not alive to tell us that, or to tell us what's true or isn't true. So therefore, we wanted, and I think, jazz was important. She's a jazz artist. Maybe Shianne, you want to talk about that, but it needed that feeling of a life lived freely. Not by the constraints of the editorial line.
And again, there's people who are telling their versions of Billie and their experiences of her. It would have had a different perspective anyway. So her family in Baltimore would have a completely different version of Billie while she was, living the dream in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance. And that would be a completely different experience of the record producer in Manhattan. So it was really important to kind of have these first-hand experiences, because it added to that part in the story, and it added to that context. And we even saw it when we were listening to the tapes, like the music that was listened to at the time when Linda was interviewing these musicians or her family. It very much felt that they were, like, at that moment they were living in a specific time, so you could get a feel of the time, maybe if that was the music that was in the cafes and the Chilettes was playing. And I remember listening and thinking, you really do feel like you're back in the 70s, because that's when the interviews had taken place, and you're hearing all of this new music which would be new then, and you just feel really transfixed on the fact that this is somebody's perspective who knew Billie 30 years ago, and in that moment, and it's shifting.
So there are different layers of time, aren't they, within the film? And James, earlier when we spoke, you kind of talked about the way that actually the power influenced the perspective that people had on Billie. So let's say the record company producer is going to have more invested perhaps in the way that he tells the story about Billie than say her friend or her roommate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was a really big juggling act, and actually people have said to me, oh, why isn't there an interview with Norman Granz in there? And, as a famous record producer, Norman Granz has always had a great perspective on Billie Holiday. There was an interview with Norman Granz, to us, it was not the most interesting interview, because it didn't, we were always trying to keep a 360 portrayal. Even when we go with Artie Shaw's band, in the 1930s, it's an all-male band, but Sid Weiss's wife, May, happens to be there, and we choose her perspective. So they were always trying to find within a situation a counter narrative to some somebody that empathizes with Billie from a different perspective, and power is so important, to understand, and we were really keen within the film, I think, to show that people were all speaking from a position. And again, it goes back to the detective story, that we were sort of underlying, but it goes back to the truth of the problems in society, is that certain people get to speak and most people don't get to speak. And the narrative of history is controlled by those who have the liberty to speak, and that's, it's a massive problem right now, it's a massive problem how we tell any story, or, even a news event today, you know, you know, inevitably the news organizations go to the quickest route to who they can speak to, but you know, that doesn't offer a true perspective. It's just a story, you know, and that's, I think, you know, was important to us to show that they are just all stories. There's a series of stories about Billie Holiday, you know. In fact, nothing in this film could be true. I think the real truth is actually Billie, you know, and I think although we talk about the tapes, you know, the star of the film is still Billie Holiday, you know, and we really, and Shianne sort of took the charge in terms of like, you know, going everywhere and looking and, you know, calling photographers children's children to try and find images of Billie to keep in the film so that we stayed within a consistent visual timeline, and that was unfolding before our eyes, but also that, you know, Billie wasn't the greatest most articulate speaker, you know, as we even talk about in the film, but you know, she's a great singer and she uses her voice to tell her story, and she's talking about majorly contemporary ideas. You know, when she's talking about she's singing Now or Never at the opening of the movie, you have no doubt, because you're seeing her perform, that she is singing about sex, you know, and she's talking about later in the film about spousal abuse, and she's talking about race, you know, she's talking about like stuff that's really resonant. So I think one of the things that, you know, was important for us to do in the film was to give people the idea of it. You know, you've got an evening with one of the greatest performers of all time, but you can just hear her and see her, and you're gonna know more about what's being said about her than listening to the words of the tapes. Don't you think, Shianne?
Yeah, and I think it adds to the intimacy of her as well, especially going. I as James mentioned, I just went everywhere to try and find archive of Billie, which had never been seen, and it just really portrayed her in a more intimate setting. And I think it is brave, you know, when she talks about my man and the abuse that she received from her partners, and you know, the rape when she was a child, like all of this kind of adds to her strength and her bravery and her courage. And I think that's definitely kind of something I think we've managed to show in the film.
Absolutely, yeah. I was kind of conscious of. I was very aware of that. You know, she says so much more in the phrasing of a lyric or a little glance when she's performing than actually, and when she's, you know, reporting things about her life or in the interviews themselves. Did you feel, you know, by the end of the process of making the film that you had begun to understand her?
I think she's a really complex person to understand anyway. I think as a musician, as a singer, she's really complex because she gives one image and then you hear 5 different stories. And then you're trying to work out, who are you? Who is Billie? But I think that is the mystery of her. And I think that is why we're still talking about her today. And for future generations, I think we'll still be talking about her, because I think her story is a powerful one. And I think people can take from different elements of her character. And I think, you know, The Lady Sings the Blues, the book in itself kind of tells a story of, you know, she's trying to sort out the way she's being represented. And even in the Diana Ross film, she's kind of portrayed more as a victim. And that is especially something that we didn't want to do, is to have her portrayed as a victim, because we don't think she is. She's a strong woman who was able to operate in a society which was fundamentally working against her. And I think it was always going to be very difficult for her to succeed. And I think it's really interesting to just try and understand her. But I think Linda went on a journey trying to do that. We've gone on a journey trying to do that, and
we sort of didn't. I mean, I think we stepped back from that. I think, you know, Linda went on a journey to try and really understand Billie, and never could reach it because she didn't come from the same background. You know, Billie's obviously, you know, Linda identified it because she was subjugated as a woman. You know, obviously race is important, but it's also important to understand Billie from the perspective of the poverty from which she comes. She's not only African-American woman. She's a very poor African-American woman who basically, unlike many singers who come up through the church, Billie learns to sing in brothels. There's a very transactional nature, and there's an idea that she can't own her own story, which I think Billie's very conscious of. And I think she knows that she can never own her own story. It's always going to be forced upon her, but what she does, and you see it in the film, when she leaves Basie's band, however she leaves it, when she leaves Artie Shaw's, when she signing the divorce papers at the end, to get away from Louis, she's just saying in the end, you can only take me so far. You can only own me so much, and I am going to be free. And she does it with sexual liberation. She does it with drugs, and I think that's what's most extraordinary, is that she refuses in a way to allow anybody to own her story, because she knows that she is, the more she changes it, the freer she is,
Absolutely. I was thinking about, the kind of contemporary resonances, because towards the end of the film, there are shots, there is imagery from contemporary protests. Was it Sandra Bland and Black Lives Matter protests, and that suggests that the kind of racial struggles that are so kind of evident in the film occurring back then are still kind of being echoed now. And I was wondering, was that, were you conscious of making a political film? Was that your intention?
Our intention was to make a film about a great artist and to explore in a new way. The fact is that Billie was suppressed as a woman, and she was suppressed as an African-American woman, and trying to tell her story in a true way that resonates too. It's very unfortunate that the world hasn't actually managed to move on in many ways from Billie's life, so it's not the fault of the film that it has a political edge to it. It's the fault of society that it still has this great big, unanswered wounds, a society which has unevenness in it, but also, beyond that, Billie's suffering from generational wounds that go back 50 years before she was born, and none of this is being addressed. I mean, maybe society is beginning to be, in certain societies, are beginning to be willing to address, in Britain, its colonial heritage, is still not really being addressed, and obviously in the case of Billie, it's, slavery, it's Jim Crow, it's all those things, that only, so I don't think, the fact is her story is being told now, and it has contemporary resonance. So I think it's okay to elide into the present tense. But Shianne, you give me your perspective on it.
Yeah, no, and I think I was very keen as we were listening to the tapes and learning more about her life. It felt too present not to comment on what is happening at the moment. And I think with her story, and she doesn't get enough credit, I don't think Billie does, for being a civil rights activist in her own right. It's not something she pushed for, but with Charles Mingus, he says, she was causing riots before Martin Luther King. And just imagine that in 1930s Jim Crow America, you're singing Strange Fruit to white audiences. And the power that had, I think, was really important. And I thought we really do need to make a thing of this to show that, there's still so much to go. And I think it was important to have that political.
Even Billie singing Strange Fruit, the performance that we use is the only film performance, but it gets you, it's really it's deeply tragic, and as she's singing it to us now from 1959, it still feels like it's about today. We can still empathize with that pain, and that's her ability as a great artist, is that she can move us, or she's talking about history for her at that point, and yet we realize it's captured in the present moment.
Because I think when I rewatched that performance, especially in light of everything that's happened this summer, it has a different resonance. Obviously, at that time, you're thinking about, lynchings, but then, what's happening in America at the moment, you really do. It's like because Billie makes you listen as well to the lyrics, and you have a different feeling to it. You know, you imagine what audiences may have been thinking in the 1930s, and you know, sitting in the cinema watching it or watching it from home in 2020, you'll have your own sort of feelings which might come to you when you listen to it.
I think, yeah, I mean, that song is so powerful, and it's, you know, as you say, it's like one of the songs that most people will know her for. But actually, I'd never really had almost that image of her performing it in a white nightclub, you know, in a nightclub. It's sort of like, it's evening entertainment. It's not, you know, seeing the Nina Simone documentary and seeing her perform these civil rights songs, you know, at a rally. This was like a completely different environment, and to put that message out there was so radical, so brave. And incredibly powerful. So
yeah, I mean, it's 16 years before Rosa Parks, you know, that she starts singing that song. And it's interesting because she does the Commodore recording in 39, you know, and it's actually you know, it does pull its punch, even though it's banned by the BBC, for example. It was shocking to audience in its soft version, and yet you see in the 59 version that we have in the film, which is a much more kind of raw and visceral, you know, what it would be like to see Billie perform it unmediated by a record producer, you know, live. She did that every night pretty much for 20 years of her life when she wasn't put in prison, you know, sometimes 3 times a night, you know, sang for white audiences, and you know, that's incredibly brave, you know, especially when, you know, she knows from the first time she sings it that she's being watched by the police, you know. Cafe society is problematic for the hierarchy of America. It's a mixed club, you know, already. So she's not choosing to sing it in, you know, in Harlem, or, you know, she's choosing to sing it, you know, she's singing it to a white audience from day one, you know. She's in control of that, you know. And you know, Shianne, you should talk about the way that she sang it every night, you know.
And the way I was just about to say, like, the way she commanded the attention, the fact that whenever she sang it, she would make sure that all service stops, everybody is silent, and you would hear a pin drop. So that in itself just shows she's telling audiences, sit down, listen to me, and I'm going to tell you something. It may make you feel uncomfortable, it may make you want to walk out, but you're going to listen to me. And I think that is so strong and brave, you know, of the context. And when you do see that performance in 1959, it transports you back to that moment when she's telling people, she's also telling us as the audience, sit down, listen.
Yeah,
I'm commanding you to listen and listen to this message.
And she's telling those audiences, you know, that the money that's paying for those drinks and that admission to a nightclub is from the blood of, you know, her people, you know. I mean, it's
powerful stuff.
Powerful, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to have to wind up pretty soon, but we have had one question from the audience, the virtual audience. So we've got a question from Thomas Hitchin on Facebook, which is probably quite a good one to end on, actually. And he said, what was your biggest personal discovery when making the film? And did Billie teach you anything personally?
Go for it, Shianne.
That's a big one. I think my biggest personal discovery when making the film is probably the discovery of the riches of archive, which I found actually going on that journey and looking through all of these amazing contact sheets from the children of photographers from the 50s and 40s and 30s who took photographs with Billie and knew her personally. I think that is one of my biggest personal discoveries of her. And I think Billie just taught me to be brave and to speak my truth, and yeah, to just keep playing her music.
I think the discovery that always sticks out for me is actually it's Jimmy Fletcher. So Jimmy Fletcher is the agent who is set on her tail, who's the only black agent in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And, you know, his interview, you know, he's never, you know, he doesn't exist anywhere else on interview tape or anything. So he's got the inside track, having been there for 8 years. He befriends Billie, you know, he tells extraordinary things. But the thing that always stands out for me on that interview was the fact that the moment when he tells us that John Levy, who becomes her second husband, her common law husband, you know, was already an informant for the Bureau of Narcotics back from 1934 when he'd arrested him. And it's the sort of pressure of the system Like Billie is in this bubble. She never gets to escape. You know, she never gets to escape. The same jazz with the same promoters, the same record producers, the same agents, the same dealers / grasses from this. You know, everything is in collusion against her. You know, and so what it teaches me most about Billie is how, you know, how strong she was not to have. You know, she dies at 44, having lived this extraordinary life, but you know how she survived that long or wasn't crushed by the oppression is extraordinary.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, incredibly powerful. And as you say, as you were saying, Shianne, well, both of you, that performance, that 1959 performance, ringing out to us today, you know, with such life, with such force, with such passion, and still, you know, so much, you know, so inspiring. It's incredible. It's incredible to see. So well done, and thank you both for for your insights and for the beautiful film.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. I think we're done.
Cool.
Oh.